Daniel Walker thought he had buried his darkest secret a decade ago. But when Emily, his wife whom he believed he had killed, showed up at his doorstep alive, everything he had worked for came crashing down. The past he had buried so deeply was now knocking at his door, and it was coming to collect. Daniel Walker was the kind of man who seemed to have it all. In the small, picturesque town of Milford, he was known as the perfect husband and the model citizen. His wife, Emily, was equally admired, beautiful, kind, and always with a smile. Together, they appeared to be the ideal couple, the ones people looked up to, envying their seemingly perfect life. But as many often say, appearances can be deceiving, and the perfect life they projected was hiding a much darker reality. Daniel and Emily had been married for 7 years, a time that had started with passion and love but gradually soured with unspoken frustrations and growing resentment. Emily, once deeply in love, had begun to distance herself. She had dreams that Daniel didn't support, and his controlling nature made her feel trapped. It wasn't just small arguments anymore. It was a deep, gnawing feeling of unhappiness that neither of them addressed. They lived in the same house, but their lives had grown worlds apart. Daniel, for his part, was no longer the man Emily had fallen in love with. He had changed in subtle but unsettling ways, becoming more possessive, more demanding. He had convinced himself that Emily was ungrateful for the life he had provided her, that her discontent was a personal affront. Every day he grew more frustrated with her failure to understand the sacrifices he had made for their marriage. He worked long hours, but Emily often seemed unsatisfied. Their once passionate connection had turned into routine, and Daniel found himself spiraling, growing resentful and angry at her perceived indifference. It all came to a head on one fateful night in 2011. Their argument had started over something small, a forgotten dinner reservation, but quickly escalated into something much more explosive. Emily, tired of the constant tension, told Daniel she wanted a divorce. That was the moment the dam broke. Daniel snapped. The idea of losing Emily was more than he could bear. His mind raced with the thought of her leaving him, of the life he had worked so hard to build crumbling before his eyes. In a fit of rage, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. The violence he had always suppressed erupted, and in that moment, Emily's life ended. Her body lay motionless on the floor, the argument forgotten, replaced by the horrifying finality of his actions. In an instant, the life Daniel had carefully constructed was shattered, and he stood over the woman he had once loved, now gone forever. But Daniel wasn't panicking. He was cold, calculated. He knew exactly what he needed to do. His first thought was to cover his tracks. He had to make it look like Emily had disappeared, that she had run off to escape their troubled marriage. He staged the scene with precision, leaving everything in place to suggest a sudden, unexpected departure. But then came the most difficult part, disposing of her body. He couldn't simply call the police and say she was dead. That would be too easy. He needed to ensure she was never found. After making sure no one could link him to the crime, Daniel took her body to a secluded area outside town. He buried her deep in the woods, away from prying eyes. It was a grisly, desperate task, but Daniel knew it was necessary. Once the deed was done, he returned to the house, cleaned up, and resumed his life as though nothing had changed. The police were baffled when Emily went missing, but Daniel played the role of the grieving husband perfectly. He shed tears at the police station, gave heartfelt interviews to the local news, and did everything expected of a man who had lost the love of his life. Years passed, and the case went cold. No body, no answers. Emily was presumed dead, and Daniel's life seemed to return to normal. The pain of losing her never fully left him, but he convinced himself that he had done what needed to be done. He remarried, had children, and built a new life. He even managed to convince himself that he had moved on, that the past was behind him. But deep down, Daniel knew that his secret was still buried, as deep and silent as Emily herself. The disappearance of Emily Walker was one of those cases that seemed to captivate the small town of Milford for a while, then quickly faded into the background as life moved on. It wasn't that people forgot about Emily or stopped wondering what had happened to her. It was more that there was simply no new information. The police had investigated, questioned Daniel thoroughly, and checked every lead, but nothing substantial ever turned up. No signs of foul play, no evidence that would point to anything other than a disappearance. The investigation eventually stalled, and in the absence of anything concrete, Emily was officially declared missing. For Daniel, the years following Emily's disappearance were a strange combination of guilt and relief. He had buried the body so carefully, so thoroughly, that he convinced himself no one would ever find it. He continued to play the role of the heartbroken husband going through the motions of grief. In public, he was the picture of sorrow. His face was always solemn when he spoke of Emily's sudden disappearance, and he spent hours talking to local reporters telling them how difficult it was to lose the love of his life. But behind closed doors there were no tears. There was no sorrow. There was only the quiet satisfaction of having gotten away with the perfect crime. It wasn't long before Daniel started to rebuild his life. His grief was brief, perhaps even too brief, but it didn't matter. He remarried a few years after Emily vanished, a woman named Sarah who had been a longtime friend of the family. Sarah, a kind-hearted woman, had always been supportive and understanding, and she quickly stepped into the role of the loving wife. Daniel and Sarah had 2 children together, and life began to settle into a new normal. The pressure of keeping his secret hidden seemed to dissipate over time, and though Daniel never spoke about his past to anyone, it felt as though Emily's memory was fading with each passing year. However, there were still moments when Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. There were still times when he would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with his heart racing. His mind would race back to the night he had killed Emily, and he would remember the cold, empty pit he had buried her in. But each time those thoughts crept in, he would push them away, bury them like the secret they were. Milford had not forgotten about Emily either. While the police had officially closed the case, a few people still suspected that something wasn't right. Emily's sister, Laura, never stopped looking for answers. She never believed the idea that Emily had simply run away. It didn't make sense. Emily wasn't the type of person to abandon everything, her life, her family, her friends. But without any evidence to back up her suspicions, Laura's efforts to get the police to reopen the case had fallen on deaf ears. Emily's parents had moved away shortly after their daughter's disappearance, unable to cope with the weight of the unknown. The town had slowly begun to forget, or at least it seemed that way. But Daniel never could. No matter how much time passed, he couldn't erase the guilt that festered in the back of his mind. Every phone call from a family member or neighbor who had known Emily made him uneasy. And when the occasional comment about the missing woman would resurface, Daniel would feel a twinge of panic. He had successfully hidden his dark secret, but he knew, deep down, that the truth always has a way of coming to light, one way or another. He pushed those fears aside. Life went on. For 10 years, Daniel lived as though nothing had happened, content in the life he had built. But despite the normalcy he tried to maintain, he could never fully escape the fear that the past was lurking, waiting to catch up with him. He convinced himself that everything was fine, that Emily would never resurface. He never once imagined that one day, the doorbell would ring and the truth would knock. It was an ordinary evening in October when Daniel's world began to unravel. The air had a crisp chill to it, a reminder that autumn was settling in. He had just finished a quiet dinner with Sarah and their 2 children, who were busy finishing their homework at the dining table. The house was warm, cozy, and felt just as it always did. Peaceful, content. Daniel leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to relax after the busy day when the sharp ring of the doorbell sliced through the silence. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor asking for something, maybe a cup of sugar, or the kids wanted to play with the neighbor's dog. But when he opened the door, what he saw left him frozen in place, his heart stopping in his chest. There stood a woman, disheveled, her clothes worn and torn as if she had been through hell. Her face was gaunt, with hollow eyes. But Daniel recognized her instantly. He didn't need to see her more clearly than that to know who she was. The woman standing on his doorstep was Emily. He blinked, his breath catching in his throat, not trusting his eyes. The last time he had seen her, she had been lifeless, her body cold and buried deep in the woods. Daniel had convinced himself that he would never see her again, that his secret was buried and safe. But now, here she was, standing in front of him, alive. Her hair was longer, her face pale but unmistakably hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily simply stood there looking at him with an unreadable expression. Daniel's mind raced. How could this be possible? Was she some sort of ghost? A product of his own guilt and nightmares? Had someone somehow found her body and she had escaped, or was this some elaborate scheme to punish him? He struggled to find words. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands beginning to shake. His mind, so accustomed to maintaining control, was failing him in that moment. He couldn't comprehend the sight before him. He had buried her. He had buried her alive. How was she standing here now? Emily didn't speak. She didn't rush forward or demand answers. She just stood there looking at him, as if she had all the time in the world. Daniel, still paralyzed by disbelief, took a small step back as if to allow her into the house. He wasn't sure if this was real or if he was imagining it. Maybe it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by years of guilt and fear. But no, her presence was too real, too tangible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily stepped into the house, her eyes never leaving his face. The silence between them was deafening. Daniel's mind was a blur, trying to piece together the impossible. He had killed her. He had buried her. She couldn't be here. But she was. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stood there, frozen, unable to move. Emily sat down in the living room, her posture tired but calm, as if this was just another day. Daniel's mind reeled, spinning in every direction at once, but he couldn't form a single coherent thought. She was alive. Emily, the woman he had killed and buried, was here in front of him. And for the first time in 10 years, Daniel knew that his perfect life, the life he had worked so hard to rebuild, was about to crumble. The weight of the truth, a truth he thought he had buried with her, began to settle in. There would be no escaping now. The past had come back, and it was standing in his living room. The enormity of the situation started to hit him, but he could do nothing but stare at the woman who had somehow survived his brutal attempt to end her life. It was only then that Daniel understood. His worst fear had come true. The past wasn't done with him. As the hours passed, Daniel struggled to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. Emily, sitting across from him in the dim light of the living room, was eerily calm. She had said nothing, but her presence was an overwhelming weight in the room, one that Daniel couldn't escape. The sound of his own heartbeat seemed impossibly loud in his ears, drowning out everything else. The guilt, the years of suppressed fear, rose up like a tidal wave. How had she survived? How had she found him? Daniel wanted to speak, to ask her, but the words seemed trapped inside his chest, suffocating him. There was nothing he could say to make sense of what was happening. And even if he could, what good would it do now? His entire world, his entire life, was about to come crashing down around him, and there was no way to stop it. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice soft but carrying an unshakable firmness. "You thought I was dead, didn't you?" Her words were simple, but they sliced through him like a knife. It was as if she had peeled back the layers of his carefully constructed life, exposing him for who he truly was. His mind spun again, trying to come to terms with her return. He had been so sure, so certain, that he had buried her deep enough to disappear forever. But Emily was here, staring at him with cold, unblinking eyes, and the weight of the truth crashed down on him. "Why?" was all he managed to whisper. It wasn't a question asking how she had survived or where she had been. It was a question asking why. Why had she come back? What did she want from him now? Emily didn't answer immediately. She leaned back in the chair, her tired eyes never leaving his face. It felt like a lifetime had passed in the few moments that had passed since her arrival, and yet everything about this situation was happening too quickly for Daniel to process. "I didn't run away, Daniel," she finally said. Her voice was steady, though the pain in it was unmistakable. "You didn't kill me. You buried me alive." The words were blunt, a stark reminder of the horror she had endured. Daniel felt his stomach twist at the thought of it. He hadn't wanted to do it. He never meant for it to go that far. But he had. He had killed her. He had buried her. And for 10 years, he had convinced himself that he had gotten away with it. "I woke up," Emily continued, her voice still calm, but with an edge of something Daniel couldn't quite place. "I was alive, but I was trapped, alone, in the dark. I thought I was going to die there, but somehow, I survived. And I got out." Daniel's throat tightened. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had always thought of Emily's death as something that had happened in an instant, quick, final, irreversible. But it hadn't been. She had fought to survive. She had fought to escape him. "I spent years trying to forget everything," Emily said, her gaze softening for the briefest of moments. "I moved away. I changed my name. I tried to build a life, but you were always there. You and the secret you kept buried. And every time I saw you, it felt like you were still killing me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be calm. He hadn't expected her to be so composed. He had imagined that when Emily finally resurfaced, she would be angry, vengeful, seeking nothing but to destroy him. But Emily wasn't doing that. She wasn't demanding retribution. She was calculating, waiting. "I'm not here for vengeance, Daniel," Emily said, her voice growing even softer now. "I'm here because you owe me the truth. You owe me an explanation." Daniel swallowed hard. He was drowning in guilt, suffocating under the weight of his own sins. Emily was right. He owed her an explanation, though no explanation could ever justify what he had done. But still, he couldn't bring himself to say it. The words were stuck, lodged deep in his chest. How could he ever apologize for what he had done? How could he ever make up for burying her alive, for ripping her life away from her? Emily seemed to read the confusion in his eyes. "I don't need an apology, Daniel. I need you to understand the gravity of what you've done. I need you to understand that I am here because you can to keep running from the truth." The finality in her voice hit Daniel harder than any accusation could have. He had spent years hiding from his crime, burying the past, thinking it was over. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Emily had returned, and with her return, everything he had worked so hard to build, the life, the family, the illusion of innocence, was unraveling before his very eyes. The past was back, and it had come for him. The tension in the room was suffocating. Emily sat across from Daniel, her eyes never leaving his face, as though she were waiting for something, waiting for him to crack, waiting for him to say the words she needed to hear. Daniel, on the other hand, was paralyzed. His mind was a whirlwind of panic, guilt, and confusion. He had never anticipated this. He had thought his crime was a dark secret buried long ago, never to be uncovered. But here she was, alive, and the truth was no longer something he could hide behind. Daniel's heart raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. Emily had been gone for so long. He had buried her. He had staged her death. He had convinced everyone, including himself, that she had disappeared of her own volition. Yet now, Emily stood in front of him. Her life, her survival, a painful reminder of what he had done. His mind kept replaying the events of that night. The night he had taken her life, but she had never truly left. She had endured the unimaginable. And now she was standing before him, calmly awaiting his response. "I don't know what you want from me," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I thought you were gone. I thought I could—" "Don't," Emily interrupted, her voice sharp but not angry. It was more matter-of-fact than anything. "Don't tell me you didn't mean for it to go that far. Don't tell me you thought I was gone. You knew exactly what you were doing. You buried me alive, Daniel. You didn't just kill me. You left me to die alone in the dark." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to look away, to deny it, but he couldn't. Emily's eyes were unwavering, and every word she spoke seemed to cut deeper, unraveling the web of lies he had spent a decade spinning. He had always convinced himself that she had died in a quick, painless way, that maybe she had drowned, that maybe it had been over before she even realized what was happening. But now, hearing it from her, he understood the full horror of his actions. He had taken her life, and then he had left her to suffer. "I never wanted to hurt you like that," Daniel murmured, his voice trembling. I thought it would be better if you were just gone. I couldn't live with the idea of losing you. I couldn't let you leave me." Emily shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "You didn't love me, Daniel. You wanted to control me. And when I tried to break free, you did the only thing you knew how to do. You destroyed me." The sting of her words was unbearable. He had spent so many years denying the truth, refusing to acknowledge that it wasn't just a moment of rage. It was the culmination of years of control, manipulation, and his inability to face the reality that their marriage was falling apart. But Emily wasn't here for forgiveness. She wasn't here for any kind of reconciliation. She was here to make him face the consequences of his actions. "I didn't just survive, Daniel," Emily continued, her voice cold now. "I fought for my life. I dug myself out of the grave you left me in. I fought every single day to stay alive, to rebuild, to be free. And now you think you can just go on with your life like nothing happened? Like you didn't destroy me, my family, my everything?" Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. It was true. He had destroyed her. He had taken everything from her, and he had never once looked back. The family he had built with Sarah, the new life he had created, was nothing but a lie that had been built on the back of his darkest secret. The life he had convinced himself was real was a facade, and Emily was the one person who could shatter it all. "I don't know what you want me to do," Daniel said, his voice breaking. I can't fix this. I can't undo what I've done. You can't, Emily replied, her eyes cold and calculating. But you will answer for it. The doorbell rang suddenly, a sharp sound that cut through the thick air of tension. It was almost as if the universe was delivering its own judgment. Daniel didn't move, still lost in the storm of his emotions. Emily stood up, her expression unchanged, and walked toward the door. When she opened it, 2 police officers stood outside. Emily looked at them for a moment before turning back to Daniel. "It's over," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're going to pay for what you've done." Daniel's world collapsed around him as the officers entered the room. He didn't resist. He couldn't. There was no way out now. The truth had come for him in the form of the woman he had tried to destroy, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As they handcuffed him and led him away, Daniel finally understood. No matter how many years he had lived with the lie, no matter how many new lives he had built on the ruins of the past, the truth had a way of finding its way back. And now, there was no escaping it.